Dan Hicks, Curator of the Pitt Rivers Museum and Professor of Contemporary Archaeology at Oxford University. Thank you for talking to me. Brilliant.
Right, okay, well, thanks for having me. Hi.
Hi.
I have been at the Pitt Rivers now as curator for 13 years. And before that, I had a background in, local authority archaeology and museums. I worked for some of the county council archaeology units and museum services, and also a bit in the private sector. Originally as a gardens archaeologist. So
Really?
right at the beginning of my career, I was the sort of archaeologist that was, working on the 18th century or the 19th century, digging up gardens for the National Trust and for other,
fantastic.
historic houses and landscapes in order to inform the restoration of those gardens. So that's how I cut my teeth.
Yeah.
I then worked more generally in the commercial archaeology sector, working on every period of the human past in advance of road schemes, housing development, in people's back gardens when they were just building an extension, right the way through, to large, A roads that were being built. And that introduced me really to a range of the different material presence of all of the different sort of layers of the past, from the medieval, to the Roman, into the later prehistoric. But of course, including the, recent past, which has remained my interest.
Absolutely. Tell me a bit about the Pitt Rivers, then, its function in the past, its initial function, and how that has sort of changed and evolved into the present.
Sure. Okay. So it's an institution founded by an archaeologist and, what at the time he would have called himself an ethnologist,
Yes.
Augustus Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers, who's a man whose years of his life map almost exactly onto the Victorian period. So he was born in 1827. He was 10 years old when Queen Victoria came to the throne. He died in 1900, a year before the end of her reign. And in many ways, the Pitt Rivers, founded in 1884, is a quintessential Victorian museum, in that it sort of drew together the two disciplines of anthropology and archaeology as they were being really, invented at this time, or certainly formalized in terms of their modern sort of disciplinary shape, but also in relation to empire as well. So he acquired objects not only from excavating in the United Kingdom and Ireland, but also he purchased, objects which were washing up in London and other locations in Europe from empire. And one of the great problematic parts of his sort of thinking was that he was comparing the ethnological objects from the global south in the present with the prehistoric objects that he was excavating from the past. And that interrelationship between past and present anthropology and archaeology continues to be something with which we wrestle, today.
Absolutely. The shrunken heads, for example, that have just been removed from display.
Sure, that's right. So, I mean, what does a World Culture Museum look like in the 21st century?
Exactly.
How do we ensure that, and I think it's a challenge that faces a lot of institutions, how do you ensure that you face up to the full range of what your institution was in the past, warts and all, while also taking steps not only to tell those histories, but, where appropriate, to dismantle them, to repurpose them, and to reimagine them for the present. So, I mean, I think we've actually never needed world culture museums more than we do in the contemporary world. These are spaces in which we can tell a non-Eurocentric account of art and culture and of things that people have made and continue to make into the present from around the world. But at the same time, there is a history in certain points in the history of the institution. It's been involved in ideas of scientific racism, in the display of objects taken with violence from Africa and elsewhere in the global south. So we're also, and of course the display of human remains, as you mentioned. So
Yeah.
they're all part of what we're wrestling with, and hopefully, trying our best to offer some leadership on in the wider heritage, arts and culture sector.
So presumably that's going to lead to a new strategy in terms of storytelling and interpretation, as well as restitution.
Yes, I think it is. I think the role of the curator is really fundamentally changing in our contemporary world, not simply because our audiences are changing and the world is changing around us, but that is maybe the initial reason. I think in museums we often imagine that our role is to keep things the same, to conserve, to abate any sense of change, because that might be decay or moths eating the fabric and so on. But actually, of course, no curator can stop the world around their museum changing, and realizing that and listening to audiences, to stakeholders, and to source communities of objects. And of course, in the case of the display of human remains, there's a classic example of how something really unacceptable to so many of our visitors somehow persisted, because it's much harder to take down a display than it is, or it feels harder maybe than it is to put one up.
Absolutely. And I think something that plays into all this is the feeling that came to a head with Black Lives Matter. And suddenly all the museums are talking about decolonisation. Can you tell me a bit about that? Can you talk to me a little bit about that and how it's going to work out?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, decolonisation is not a word that I like very much, because I think there are better words out there, but it is a word. It's absolutely one of the, I guess it's a useful headline for some. The reason I'm uncomfortable with it is it's rather too often favoured by some museums who see this as either a great sort of PR opportunity, or maybe an idea of trying to hide away, their past, or kind of tell the story better so that somehow it goes away, and that's enough. And for me, these ongoing, I mean, so there's an academic called Laura Ann Stoller, who talks about not the ruins of empire, but the ongoing ruinations of empire. The ongoing violence, if you like, is ongoing. It's not in the past. Colonialism isn't over, and we therefore, of course, experience it or see it in the museum, enact it in the museum in the forms of, say, institutional racism, or allowing certain displays or certain practices, the lack of diversity, and within our workforce, the fact we don't in any adequate way, in terms of how we look, in terms of what we say, represent those wider communities that we serve. They aren't, I mean, that's not by chance. That is because this institution has a relationship with, the wider imperial project. So what that means for a museum, I think it means a different thing for different institutions, really depending on their histories and their presence. I think for the Pitt Rivers Museum, we are a university museum. We are a museum in Oxford. We're a museum of world culture, but we've also got a profile and a platform through which we can maybe try our best, to offer leadership, or at least ask some hard questions for world culture museums around the country. So in the UK, most of our great sort of cities have a world culture museum or world culture collection in their, whether in sort of Brighton, in Leeds, in Newcastle, in, Manchester, Liverpool, Exeter, Belfast, you can go on. There are world culture museums. There are museums filled with, looted African objects, not only in the British Museum or in Oxford, but in other cities. So there's a real job to be done there, I think, in terms of facing up to those histories and thinking about the status of these objects in a contemporary world.
That brings us to your book, really. Tell me about your book and the forces.
Sure, I've got a copy of it. Yeah, there we go. So I got my advance copies. It's out on the 5th of November, and so you're really excited to see a physical copy of it.
I've pre-ordered it, I have to say.
I'm
I
sorry.
have ordered it. I've pre-ordered.
Good. Yeah, so it's available to pre-order. Exactly, it's out in all good bookshops on the 5th of November. And of course, I'm having under current conditions, I'm having to do a virtual book tour, but I will be, digitally going to a series of different venues over November to January to talk to different audiences. Almost all of which will be open, I think, to all comers. So there'll be details. Probably on my Twitter feed is the best place to find those. But so the Brutish Museums is really just a first attempt to try and use, my knowledge of the collections of the Pitt Rivers, to tell a story about, one instance of, the violent looting of African art, the ways in which it has been a part of the exhibitionary complex of a university museum over 130 years, and really what that means in the present for restitution. For me, cultural restitution, and I think for everyone interested in this topic, has to be something that involves a case-by-case approach. Right. You can't, this old idea of empty galleries, send it all back, where will it end? We hear from some of the extremists at the kind of ultra retentionist end, who see conversations about restitution as iconoclasm, as a challenge to the museum, as an attack upon museums. All that bears no relation at all to what the real conversations among professionals, like myself, really involve, which are really about how we listen, how we do our job, how we share knowledge of the objects in our care at present, and how when those objects are asked for back, we listen to those claims, we take them seriously, but also we don't just engage in dialogue. We see that dialogue as sort of, potentially leading to action as well.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Museums Unlocked is something that I'm very interested in.
Okay. Yeah, so in some ways, lockdown was in March when that happened, the first time round in the UK. It was an incredibly emotional moment, I think, for everyone in the cultural and heritage sector. A lot of our colleagues were put on furlough. Obviously, I wasn't physically able to go into the museum, even into my office where I sit now. And that was the case, of course, for our visitors not being able to, to visit, but also for artists, for curators, for other people who work in museums or work with museums. So everyone from front of house to education teams, to conservators, to curators were unable to go in. So I, with what turned into a wider community, started really to share a series of themed sort of days that tried to offer something on the digital side of heritage and culture that isn't, naff. Because I think there was in those early days, if we think back to late March, there were directors of large and important museums were calling in over Zoom their digital team saying, "Where's our online content? What can we create? How can we do something in this moment?" And of course, if you didn't have any decent online content at that point, you weren't under those conditions, with people homeschooling, with people self-isolating, with people having to cope with the sheer anxiety of it all, that wasn't going to happen. So, there are a number of very successful projects, I think, that responded in different ways to lockdown. And I hope that, Museums Unlocked was one of them that sort of did something that I think lockdown more generally for the economy and society sort of did. It speeded up processes or threw processes into relief. Which were actually already happening. They were already going on. So in my world, something that was already going on was a sort of letting go of the curatorial authority, the inward-looking notion of thinking about how we think about museums, how we curate content, and not. Someone said to me at one point it was a crowdsourcing sort of project. Actually, it was much more of a community building project.
Yes.
So the idea was each day a different theme, just inviting people to share photographs from their hard drives, their iPhones, their memories of certain cultural sites, locations. Initially, we began with a sort of geographical approach. So we visited the British Museum, and we visited the V&A, and then we started visiting different cities and regions of the UK. There was one weekend where we took a little holiday and went to Venice and to New York on the Saturday and the Sunday, and that worked incredibly well, with people just sharing and celebrating. But here, the community, which partly was my own Twitter community, which I was part of already, but also a sort of a growing community of people with real expertise, artists, curators, furloughed museum workers, unable to tweet or write or engage with their own museum because of conditions of furlough, but able to share their photographs of, the sites they love in, Devon and Cornwall, or in the Highlands and Islands, or wherever. So for me, it was about that idea of the sort of visual moment that lockdown involved. It was a visual project. It was about sharing. We all suddenly weren't seeing each other physically. We couldn't walk. We couldn't even go out of the house at some points. But here we were staring at each other on screens. It was visual in that way. It was all screen-led. Yes. And so sharing photographs became an incredibly important way of doing it. And the project was both then about kind of memory and celebration of the places that we love, but also looking forward to the places we want to go when all this horrible time is over.
Which is so important, yeah. Tell me a bit more about the shift in a sort of curatorial role and the move towards a less passive audience, or a less didactic curatorial role, perhaps.
Yeah, that's right. So we did 100 days of Museums Unlocked with the intention. And indeed, 100 days are now archived on the Twitter handle at Museums Unlocked, where in each of these moments, as they're called on Twitter, we spent a lot of time archiving each of the tweets. I thanked everybody for that, which sounds like a silly thing, but actually thanking people for their contributions, which took me about an hour and a half every evening, was an incredibly important part of the process. Because those 100 days became, in retrospect, quite an interesting contrast with the other famous 100 themed way of looking at museums, which is, if you like, the Neil McGregor History of the World in 100 Objects. History of the World in 100 Objects operates, we've all got a copy on our shelves, and we've all heard, and they were actually repeating the radio show over the course of lockdown. That's the ultra, that's the kind of example of the authoritarian, not really authoritarian, poor old Neil, he's not authoritarian, but the idea of the curatorial voice is the authority. Here's a great story of the world that I'm going to tell you, illustrated, by these objects. In the 100 days of the Museums Unlocked project, it worked exactly the opposite. I came up with a theme. Sometimes we voted on themes. Towards the end, I started the second half. I largely, my sort of curatorial role was to think of some good themes. But then people took it in all sorts of directions. I offered some steers. I encouraged people not to share images of human remains, for example. There were various sorts of questions over the coverage of the global south in the same as we would do in any other museum space, the diversity of voices and so on. But really, actually, when they were themes, it was up to people for the community to co-curate this space. And to some degree, that was something I learned back in 2019, or I guess 2018 to 19, in the co-curation process for the exhibit, which I was involved in on the Calais jungle, which we called LANDE.
That's right.
LANDE, which was a temporary exhibition in here at the Pitt Rivers, which was co-curated by men four men who had made an irregular crossing from Calais, had spent time, living at the Calais jungle, and were now in the UK trying to make a career in arts and, in one case, archaeology, heritage, and so on. And four women who had been at the Calais jungle as charity volunteers, supporting, life at the camp. There, the choice of objects, the choice of images, the stories that were told were being led very much, by putting me absolutely out of my comfort zone, by allowing those 9 people, to come together and to really decide on what the exhibit looked like in that way. So for Museums Unlocked, in a very different way, there was this sort of equitable approach that was something also about the Zoom call, I think. I mean, maybe I'm overly optimistic in thinking all these technologies to some degree offer a sort of, everyone gets their little box and it's the same size as each other. And if we get this moment right, this sort of acceleration of the digital in arts and heritage and culture, maybe it can be a time where we can have really, genuinely new conversations, where the difference between the avocational and the professional, the difference in between someone in the north of England and in London, the difference between somebody elsewhere in the world, the normal sort of prejudices over gender, ethnicity, and so on. Maybe they're going. Who knows? Maybe that's too optimistic. But I felt we managed certainly to create in that project some degree, a different sort of equitable space. It was an experiment. It was open-ended. I'm not sure it's over. I think there are lots of ideas, lots of approaches from people about what to do with the Museums Unlocked idea.
Yes.
We might do something. So I'm sure something will happen with it in the future. But I'm a great fan of thinking of museums as spaces of hesitation, and I'm hesitating with Museums Unlocked just to think about where it might go next.
Yeah,